Alright, so now we're going to move on and look at Seaborn. So Seaborn is it's its own library, but it's basically built on top of Matplotlib, and it makes it easier to generate some types of graphs. So anyway, that's what we're going to look at now. Note that there's more you can do with Seaborn and also more you can do with editing in Seaborn, but I tried to stick with editing in Matplotlib even when we create the graphs using Seaborn, just so you didn't have to use or learn a lot of additional syntax. Okay, so anyway, I'm importing Seaborn here as SNS. That's, again, just the alias name. Okay, so once that's imported, now this rel plot is for like looking at relationships between variables, so it should basically make a scatter plot by default. So again, we're just doing the x is elevation, y is temperature, and then you specify the data object. So in this case, it's the HP pandas data frame. So pretty clean syntax. That's one thing nice about Seaborn. And then that generates plots. Very similar to the first plot we created with Matplotlib above. And this is just showing a few other things. So now we're going to try to map other variables to different graphic parameters. So basically hue is the color of the point, and now I'm going to map that to the state name. Now we'll have a differentiation by state. So each state has a unique color, and since those colors are not self-explanatory, they're mappings, it adds in a legend there for you. And then lastly, what did I do different here? Oh, I just swapped. Oh, no, that looks the same. I don't see a difference. Oh, sorry. Instead of doing hue, I did style, and so now it assigns a different a different symbol, like a symbol shape or whatever geometric shape, as opposed to a color. So that allows us to look in not just two variables, but two continuous variables, one on x, one on y, and then a categorical variable as color or as basically the shape or symbol type. All right, and then here I'm just showing how to do some editing of those graphs. So again, I'm creating a Matplotlib plot with one subplot, and then I basically create this SNS scatter plot, and then Seaborn scatter plot, and I place it in the subplot within the figure. That's what this axis equals axis argument does, right? So this is the axis variable, so I'm placing it in there. And then once that Seaborn plot is placed inside that axis or the subplot, then I can actually edit it, right? So here I'm just setting a title. This is for dealing with the legend, so this allows you to get the handles and the labels, and then this goes through and you can like actually use those. So the handles are basically the categories, and then these are the labels associated with the categories. Note here, which I actually didn't change at all. I'm just using them. And then the title I set to state instead of state underscore name. Generally, it's good to try to avoid having like weird field names and stuff, obviously, in your layouts and your legends and stuff. And then I changed the font size. And then here I'm setting the titles, font size and color, x-axis title, font size and color, y-axis font size and color, defining tick mark labels for x and y-axis, plotting a grid, and then changing the background color. So again, what's kind of cool with Seaborn, since it sets on top of Matplotlib, is we used it basically to create a nice scatter plot with an additional variable there, color representing states, and then we could still do a lot of editing on it using the syntax available through Matplotlib, which is nice. Note the big things we did, other than like dealing with the axes and whatnot, was the legend. So again, we got a nice clean legend here where it says state, and then all the different state names and whatnot. You can also like map certain colors to certain objects and stuff, but I didn't do that here. Okay, so here's another example. So Again, we're trying to show editing now as opposed to just making the plot. So I again make a new plot with one subplot in it, and then I create a box plot with Seaborn, and then place it into the subplot, and then I can go through and edit it. Right. So let's just run it, and then we'll look at why it looks the way it does. Okay. So yeah, so anyway, it's the x-axis is subregion and the y-axis is median income, and we're getting it from the county's data set. Now note that let's see here, what was it? Oh, the x variable actually is in this case a category as opposed to like an x or a continuous variable, right? So it's the region of the country. Yeah, so you can't, for a box plot, you can't have two continuous variables. So if you try to give it something continuous, it's going to yell at you, more than likely. All right, again, so just setting a title, font size, font color, x-axis and y-axis labels, and then font size and color. This changes the default limits for the y-axis, so we want to go from 10,000 to 100,000 as opposed to the default, which I believe was 0 to something. And then setting our tick labels every basically 10,000, or sorry, tick breaks, and then the associated labels. And then here I'm changing the labels on the x-axis. So again, you just need to know what the correct order is. They're generally alphabetical unless you specify otherwise, or there's an orders or like levels defined. Yeah, and then we add a grid. We give the grid a certain color. Give it a transparency, make it a dash line, change the line width, and then it's going to be on the y-axis as opposed to the x-axis. And then I change the background color. That's that. All right, let's see what this one was. This is basically the same thing, but now I'm doing a different type of plot. So I'm doing a violin plot. Violin plot is basically a kernel density plot that's mirrored and then turned on its side. It's often used along with or as a replacement for a box plot. So this is basically the same thing. Nothing new to change after this. I just mapped a different type of plot into the subplot, again, which was created with Seaborn, but everything else is effectively the same. I'll note also the rotation. I didn't mention that above, but again, I rotated the labels there. Let me see here. All right. This is just showing a couple other types of plots that you can generate. So first thing, so again, I'm creating a plot with subplots, but this time I'm making one row and two columns. So I'm going to have two plots. The first one is a histogram, and I'm just making that with matplotlib. And then the second one is a kernel density plot, which I'm making with Seaborn. And it gets mapped into the second position. It gets mapped into the first position. And then change background color. Right? So this is just showing you how you can have multiple plots, and some of them could be generated using Seaborn, and some could be generated using matplotlib. Just real quick, if we wanted to do this differently, we could do something like 2, 1, and then we'll get them stacked as opposed to side by side. Pardon me. Okay, cool. Yeah, and then just for the heck of it, if we could do like, we could swap the indexes, change the order. All right, let's look at this. So the main thing I did here that I wanted to show that was different was the use of color palettes. So here I'm specifying this set palette, and there's some named color palettes that Seaborn provides, and then I'm actually like using those color palettes in the graph, or when I to generate the colors. So let's step through that a little bit. So again, calling color palettes, creating our figure with one subplot, creating a box plot with matplotlib. Applying, adding a title, adding the X and Y axis labels, editing the tick marks. Yep. And lastly here, again, this is just using a different color palette. So this is the palette. So here I didn't really apply the color palette, right? So I made them, but I didn't like apply them. Well, actually, sorry, I did. So this like sets the palette, and this applies the color palette to use, and this just gets applied to color. So that's what these two arguments do. This is showing another way to do it. So whenever I create the box plot, I can provide this palette argument, and then I can set the color palette. So basically saying I'm using set 1 and I need 9 colors. And then this is the desaturate option to make it a little bit more desaturated. So this is like basically two different methods. So here you basically set a color palette and then set it and then as the default style. So whenever it makes the box plot, it applies those colors. Or you can specify it within the plot creation itself. I actually like this method more personally. That's just personal preference.